Story 1. The Harvest Demon of Raven's Hollow by Sarah B.R. Welcome back to the Horror Shack. I've always been drawn to small towns. I guess it's the peace and simplicity that comes with them. Everything's quiet. People know each other by name, and life just feels slower. But I never expected that Raven's Hollow, the town where I grew up, would change me. Tonight, we'll explore true small-town horror stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. But first, we would love you to comment where you're listening from and what time is it currently for you. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more spine-tingling episodes. Now, let's get comfy. No one warned me about what happened during this year's Harvest Festival, or what I would find in the dark corners of Raven's Hollow's past. It all started a few weeks before the Harvest Festival. Normally, we'd be gearing up for the usual preparations, setting up stalls, decorating the town square, and making sure the crops were good to go. But something felt different this year. I don't know how to explain it. Maybe it was just me, maybe I was just paying more attention, but it felt like the town was holding its breath, waiting for something. It wasn't the usual excitement of fall or the buzz of the festival coming up. It was almost like everyone was pretending to be normal, like the air had thickened somehow, and no one dared to say why. I noticed it first with the crops. We've had good seasons in Raven's Hollow before. Nothing spectacular, but enough to keep the town running, you know? But this year, the crops were withering. The corn, the pumpkins, even the apples. All of it was dying off earlier than usual. Farmers were frantic, trying to figure out what was going on. Some were blaming the weather, but that didn't explain everything. Even with good weather, the fields should have been fine. They weren't, and that's when the first person disappeared. Her name was Emma. Emma and I had been in school together. Not that we were close, but we knew each other well enough. She was about 2 years older than me, and I always thought she was one of those people who had everything together. She was a natural leader, always organizing community events, volunteering, and just being one of the more positive people in the town. That's what made her disappearance so strange. Emma didn't just vanish without a trace. People tried to look for her. Search parties went out into the woods, asking if anyone had seen her or heard anything. But no one had. It was like she just stepped out of existence. I don't know why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I mean, yeah, small towns can be quiet, but people don't just disappear like that. And then, a couple of days after Emma, it happened again. Another person vanished, and then another. Each one was more unsettling than the last. They didn't all have the same connection, but they were all people who had played some role in the Harvest Festival preparations. I remember sitting in the local diner with my best friend, Mia. We'd been talking about the disappearances, speculating about what was going on. Mia was practical. She didn't buy into the supernatural stuff that people would sometimes whisper about. But even she was starting to get nervous. You think it's just coincidence? I asked her. I mean, it's all happening so close to the festival. She shook her head, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. Maybe. Or maybe it's just bad luck. You know how people love to make up stories when things go wrong in small towns. But even Mia's voice wavered, and I could see the doubt in her eyes. Then there was the symbol. It was like something out of a nightmare. I stumbled across it when I was walking home from the diner one evening. I had cut through the town square, which was usually just empty at that time of night. But when I looked down at the pavement, I saw something carved into the ground, something that hadn't been there before. At first, I thought it was just a scratch, maybe from a stone, but when I got closer, I realized it was a symbol. I'd never seen anything like it. It was crude, scratched out of the stone, but there was no mistaking it. It looked like a circle with strange markings inside of it, and something about it just felt wrong, like it didn't belong. I tried to forget about it, but I couldn't. The more I thought about it, the more my mind went back to the stories I had heard growing up. Stories that the older folks in town would tell in hushed voices when they thought no one was listening. Stories about the town's origins, about deals made long ago, about things that should have stayed forgotten. I started asking around, digging into the town's history. I went to the local library and pulled out old records. I didn't find much at first, but then I came across a journal. It belonged to one of the town's first settlers, a man named Thomas Ward. The journal was old, the pages yellowed and fragile, but what it described made my stomach twist. Thomas Ward had written about a deal made with a powerful entity in exchange for bountiful harvests. The town's founders had promised sacrifices every year to keep the land fertile, to keep the crops healthy. Over time, the rituals had been forgotten, but the deal, according to the journal, was still in place. And that symbol I had seen? It was part of the ritual, a mark used to summon the demon that had once been worshipped. I couldn't believe what I was reading. A demon? Sacrifices? It sounded like something out of a horror movie, but the journal was clear. And the more I read, the more it became clear to me that the disappearances were connected. The demon hadn't gotten its sacrifices for years, and now it was angry. And if I didn't do something, it would be unleashed fully during the harvest festival. I had to act fast. The festival was only a few days away, and I wasn't sure how much time I had left. I dug deeper into the journal and found the ritual I needed to perform to stop the demon, but it wasn't going to be easy. The ritual had to be done at a specific time, and I had to gather certain items from the town's oldest landmarks. That meant going into the woods to the stone circle, an ancient place that was said to be where the first settlers had made their pact. But as the days passed, things only got worse. More people disappeared, crops continued to fail, and a strange unease settled over the town. There was no more denying it. Something terrible was about to happen. I couldn't do it alone, so I went to Mia, who at this point was starting to believe me, despite her practical nature. I explained what I had found and what needed to be done. She didn't hesitate. She agreed to help, even though I knew she was scared. I was scared too, but it felt like we had no choice. If we didn't act now, the demon would return, and I wasn't sure the town would survive. As we prepared, though, there was a feeling of dread that hung in the air. The harvest festival was drawing near, and the clock was ticking. Could we stop the demon in time? Or had the town's fate already been sealed? If you're wondering if we succeeded, well, I'll tell you this. The harvest festival came, and with it the demon returned. But it wasn't the end. I'll tell you the rest of what happened next. But first, I need you to understand that Raven's Hollow is no longer the same town it once was. The festival never truly ends, and every year, the town will need to make a choice, just like it always has. The day of the harvest festival finally arrived, and the entire town seemed to hold its breath. You could feel it in the air, that uneasy tension. Normally, people would be celebrating, their faces painted with joy, but not this time. It was like everyone was pretending to enjoy themselves, pretending to participate in the festivities as if they were just going through the motions. Even the most excited children seemed to be quieter than usual, their laughter more hollow than before. I had a sinking feeling in my gut all day long. The streets were lined with stalls selling food, games, and handmade crafts, but none of it felt real. It felt like a facade, a cover-up for something far darker. The sound of the music playing from the town square was so loud, yet it only added to the oppressive silence that hung over the town. The farmers and townspeople were walking around, faces strained, as though they could all feel something crawling just beneath the surface, waiting to burst out. I met up with Mia in the late afternoon, just before the main event of the festival began. We made our way through the crowd, sticking to the edges as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the square. I could feel my pulse quickening. The ritual had to be done by dusk. The journal had been clear about that. No later, no sooner. I had gathered the items we needed. A handful of earth from the stone circle, a vial of water from the old well behind the church, a single flame from the highest point in the town, and the dried herbs that had been prescribed in the journal. All we had to do now was make it to the stone circle and complete the ritual before the demon fully awakened. Mia kept looking at me like she was expecting me to say something reassuring. but I didn't have the words. I could only manage a shaky smile as we pushed our way through the crowd, my heart racing in my chest. "I don't like this, Sarah," Mia said, her voice barely audible over the noise. "This whole thing, it doesn't feel right." "I know," I whispered back, forcing the words out despite the lump in my throat. "But we don't have a choice anymore. We have to do this, or it'll be too late." We reached the edge of town and started down the old dirt road that led to the woods. The air felt colder here, and as we passed the edge of the last row of houses, I couldn't help but look over my shoulder. I felt like we were being watched, but there was no one around. Just the trees swaying gently in the wind, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us, lurking just out of sight. We made our way deeper into the woods, the sounds of the festival fading behind us. The trees were thick here, their gnarled branches intertwining above us, blocking out the last of the daylight. The path became narrower as we walked, the underbrush thick and tangled. I could hear the sound of our footsteps, muffled by the soft earth beneath us, but nothing else. There were no birds, no rustling animals, just the eerie silence that seemed to deepen the further we went. When we finally reached the stone circle, it was almost dark. The stones stood like silent sentinels, weathered by time, their surfaces worn smooth from centuries of exposure. In the center, the earth was damp and soft, and a slight breeze stirred the leaves at the edge of the circle. I could feel the weight of it all, the history of this place, the ancient power that still lingered in the soil beneath my feet. The air smelled different here, heavy with the scent of old, decaying leaves and something else, something metallic. Mia was tense, standing a little to the side, her eyes scanning the trees as though she expected something to jump out at us at any moment. But I wasn't paying attention to her. My eyes were fixed on the stones. I dropped to my knees in the center of the circle and began to arrange the items as described in the journal. The earth, the water, the flame. I could hear Mia's breath quicken behind me, but I focused all my energy on the ritual. The journal had said that once the items were set, I had to chant the words written in the old text, in the language I couldn't even recognize. The words were foreign to me, and even as I spoke them aloud, I wasn't sure I was pronouncing them correctly. The moment I began to speak, the air grew colder, and the trees seemed to bend in closer, their shadows reaching toward us like skeletal fingers. That's when I felt it, a presence, a heavy, oppressive weight in the air, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I looked up, expecting to see something, someone, but there was nothing, just the stone circle, the trees, and the growing darkness. Mia grabbed my arm suddenly, her grip tight. "Sarah, what's happening? This doesn't feel right." I couldn't answer her. My mind was too focused on the chant. It had to be finished before the final bell rang in town. The ritual was supposed to bind the demon, to force it back into the earth where it had come from. But the moment I finished the final word, the ground trembled beneath me. It was subtle at first, like the deep rumble of an earthquake far away, but then it intensified. The stones began to shake, their ancient surfaces cracking, splitting open as a low growl echoed through the trees. I felt the temperature drop even more, my breath visible in the air. From the shadows, I saw it, something shifting, moving with unnatural speed. A figure, too tall, too wide to be human, silhouetted against the backdrop of the trees. I could barely make out the shape, but it was there, moving closer, its presence suffocating. Mia screamed, pulling me up, but it was too late. The demon had awoken. I don't know how long we stood there, frozen in fear, but when I finally turned to look back at the stone circle, it was gone. The ground had stopped shaking, and the eerie silence returned. But something felt wrong, very wrong. Then I heard the laughter. It started as a faint whisper, but it grew louder, more menacing, until it was echoing in my ears, rattling my bones. I grabbed Mia, and together, we stumbled back down the path, the darkness pressing in on all sides. When we made it back to town, it was chaos. People were screaming, running in every direction. Fires had started in the town square, the flames casting long shadows over the frantic crowd. I could see faces, twisted in terror, but I couldn't make out who they were. It was as if everything had become a blur, a nightmare unfolding in front of me. I looked around, searching for some sign of the demon, but there was nothing. No figure, no glowing eyes. Just the panic of the townspeople as they scattered, not knowing where to go, where to hide. And then I saw it. The symbol, the same one I had found carved into the town square, was glowing faintly in the ground. It was alive, pulsing with an eerie energy. The demon's mark. Mia tugged at my sleeve. We need to leave. Now. It's not over. It's never going to be over. I nodded, my heart sinking into my stomach. She was right. The town's fate was sealed. We made our way out of the square, but as we left, I looked back at the chaos behind us. The demon was bound to the land, but it was far from gone. It was watching, waiting, lurking just out of sight. And now, every year, when the Harvest Festival came around again, Raven's Hollow would need to offer a sacrifice to keep the demon's wrath at bay. I didn't know who would be next, but I knew one thing for sure. Raven's Hollow would never be the same again, and neither would I. We walked in silence, our footsteps heavy on the dirt path, the sounds of chaos from Raven's Hollow drifting faintly behind us. Mia didn't look at me. She kept her eyes forward, as if she could somehow outrun the terror that was following us. But I knew the truth. There was no escaping it. Raven's Hollow wasn't just a town. It was a place bound by something older, darker, and far more dangerous than any of us could have ever imagined. The further we moved from the square, the more the oppressive weight of the town's curse settled in. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of everything that had just happened. We had completed the ritual, hadn't we? We had done everything right. But somehow, something had gone wrong. The demon had been awakened, but it hadn't been fully stopped. It had been bound to the land, yes, but not destroyed. It was still there, lurking in the shadows, feeding off the fear and the desperation that had permeated the town for so long. As we reached the edge of town, I caught sight of something in the distance, something that shouldn't have been there. A figure standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the last row of houses. At first, I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but then the figure moved, slowly, deliberately. It was tall, too tall for a normal person, and its limbs, they were elongated, almost unnatural, as though they didn't quite belong to its body. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Mia didn't notice at first. She was too focused on moving quickly, her face a mask of fear. But when I grabbed her arm, she whipped around to follow my gaze. Her eyes widened, and her breath hitched in her throat. "Sarah, what is that?" she whispered, barely able to form the words. I didn't have an answer. I couldn't find the words. All I knew was that whatever it wasn't human. Its silhouette was too perfect, too unnatural. The way it moved, slowly, as if savoring every step, was like something out of a nightmare. "We need to keep going," I said, my voice shaking as I tugged on Mia's arm. "Come on, we can't stay here." We turned away from the figure and started walking faster, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle of the trees, every shadow that passed across the ground felt like it was following us. The sense of being hunted was overwhelming, suffocating, but I couldn't bring myself to look back. I couldn't risk seeing what was following us. We reached the edge of the town, but as we walked past the last few houses, the sight of the church caught my eye. The old church, the one that had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. It had always been a place of strange rumors and whispered stories, but now it seemed different. The once decaying building looked unnaturally pristine, as if it had been freshly painted, the stained glass windows gleaming in the moonlight. It was impossible. That church had been abandoned for years. There was no way it could look like this. But there it was, standing tall and imposing, its doors wide open, as if inviting us in. "Why is the church open?" Mia asked, her voice full of dread. I didn't know how to answer her. I had heard the rumors too, the stories of strange things happening at the church. People said the building was cursed, that the foundation of the church was built on the site of an ancient burial ground. Some claimed the church itself had once been the center of dark rituals, that it had been abandoned because of the evil that had seeped into its walls. I didn't believe in that kind of stuff. I had always thought it was just superstition, rumors meant to scare kids. But now, as I stared at the church, I couldn't help but feel a chill crawl down my spine. Something was wrong here, something I couldn't explain. "We need to stay away from it," I said, pulling Mia away from the church. "Let's just get out of here. We can't go inside." But Mia wasn't listening. She was already walking toward the open door, her footsteps slow and hesitant, as though she was being drawn in by something invisible. "Sarah, I think we have to go in. I don't think we have a choice anymore." I grabbed her arm again, pulling her back. "No, we're not going in there." But she shook her head, her eyes distant, as though something had taken hold of her mind. "I don't think we can leave. We have to face it. We have to face whatever's waiting for us." My heart raced as I realized what she meant. She wasn't talking about the demon. She was talking about the town itself, the land that had been bound by the ritual, the land that had been cursed long before we ever arrived. Before I could stop her, Mia stepped into the church. The door creaked as it swung open, and the moment she crossed the threshold, a loud crack rang through the air. The ground beneath my feet trembled, and the church seemed to shudder, as though it was waking up from a long slumber. "Mia!" I shouted, but my voice was swallowed by the heavy silence that surrounded me. I ran after her, but as I stepped into the church, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. The interior was darker than I had imagined, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. But there was something else in the air, a strange, oppressive energy that made it hard to breathe. The walls seemed to pulse, the shadows shifting as if alive. The stained glass windows, once so beautiful, now looked like they were cracked, their colors swirling like dark pools of blood. "Mia," I called out, my voice trembling. She didn't answer, but I could hear her whispering, not to me, but to something else, something I couldn't see. The sound of her voice was strange, hollow, as if she was speaking from a great distance. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold stone walls as I moved deeper into the church. When I found Mia, she was standing at the altar, her face twisted in a way that I couldn't recognize. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, staring into the darkness beyond the altar as if there was something there, something that only she could see. Her mouth moved, but the words she spoke were foreign, unfamiliar. It was like she was speaking a language I had never heard before. "Mia, snap out of it," I shouted, rushing toward her. But as I touched her shoulder, she turned to face me, her eyes wide with terror. "Sarah, it's too late," she whispered. "The demon is inside me." My blood ran cold. No, this couldn't be happening. "Mia, no," I screamed, shaking her. "You have to fight it." But the moment I touched her, I felt the cold, a deep, suffocating cold that seeped into my bones. It wasn't just the air, it was something inside her, something ancient, something alive. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The ground trembled again, more violently this time. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, and the shadows shifted, growing longer, darker. Something was coming. something far worse than anything we had faced so far. I had to get out of there, but as I turned to run, the door slammed shut again. The walls seemed to close in on me, and I could feel the darkness wrapping around me, suffocating me. And then I heard it, a voice slow, guttural, and full of malice. It was coming from the walls, from the very stones of the church. "You should never have come back," the voice hissed. "Now you belong to me." The demon had returned. The air in the church grew thick, suffocating. I couldn't breathe. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, twitching and slithering like living things. The walls closed in around me, but I couldn't escape. There was no way out. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but my legs were rooted to the floor, as if some unseen force was holding me in place. My heart pounded, each beat echoing like thunder in my chest. Mia stood there at the altar, her eyes wide, her body rigid. She didn't look like herself anymore. It was as if she was merely a vessel, a shell for something far darker, far older than anything human. Her lips curled into a twisted smile, and the voice that came from her was not her own. It was deep, resonating with an unnatural power that made my skin crawl. "You cannot run," the voice hissed again, this time louder, as if it was everywhere, coming from the walls, the floor, the air itself. "The pact is sealed. Your blood belongs to me now." My breath hitched as I stumbled backward, trying to put distance between myself and Mia, whatever had taken hold of her. But as I stepped back, the room seemed to stretch, the walls expanding like some sort of grotesque carnival funhouse. The altar, which had been only a few feet away, now loomed far in the distance, as though the entire church had warped, pulling me deeper into its nightmare. I reached for the door, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the handle. It wouldn't budge. Of course it wouldn't. I was trapped. There was no escape. Then the whispers came. At first, they were soft, just faint murmurs that tickled the back of my mind. But as the seconds dragged on, they grew louder, more urgent. The voices were everywhere. They seeped from the cracks in the stone walls, from the beams above me, from the very air I breathed. Each voice was different, distinct. Some were pleading, others mocking. All of them were filled with a hunger that made my skin crawl. "Help me. Run while you still can. It's too late. We've all been lost." I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the cacophony, but it was no use. The voices pierced my thoughts, dragging me back to the horrors I'd discovered. The demon, this thing, this force, had been waiting all along, festering beneath the surface of Raven's Hollow. I had been foolish to think the ritual would stop it, foolish to think we could contain it. It was too strong, too ancient. The voices mixed with Mia's, her pleading whispers now sounding distorted, as if they were coming from somewhere deep inside the church, echoing through the hollow walls. And then, as I turned my head, I saw something, a shadow, shifting in the far corner of the church, barely perceptible at first, but then it grew. Slowly, the shadow stretched across the stone floor, impossibly tall, until it was nearly at the ceiling. It moved with a purpose, like a predator stalking its prey. My breath caught in my throat. The thing from the corner of the church wasn't just a shadow. It was real. The darkness seemed to take shape, forming into a figure, a silhouette of a tall, hulking creature, its limbs far too long, its body too thin. It had no face, just a mass of darkness, swirling like smoke. It wasn't human. As it stepped forward, the temperature in the room dropped dramatically, a blast of cold air hitting me like a physical blow. I could feel the weight of it, the power in its presence, and the closer it got, the harder it became to breathe. It was as if the very air around me had been sucked out, leaving only an oppressive silence in its wake. And then I heard it, soft at first but unmistakable, a laugh, a dry, raspy sound that echoed from the depths of the creature's form, like the sound of cracked earth breaking apart. "You think you can stop me?" The voice came not from Mia anymore, but from the creature itself. It was deep, its tone full of amusement. "You think you can stop the cycle?" I didn't know what to do. My mind raced for an answer, a way to undo what had been done. But there was nothing. There was no way to take back the past, no way to undo the blood that had been spilled. The ritual, my attempt to banish the demon, had only made it stronger, had only confirmed the pact that had been made long ago. The creature advanced, its dark form moving like liquid, folding in on itself, as if it were both solid and formless at the same time. It towered over me, casting an impossible shadow that seemed to stretch across the walls and floor, enveloping the entire church. I backed up, but my legs gave way beneath me. I fell to the cold stone floor, my heart racing, my mind blank. Panic set in. This was it. This was the end. The creature's laugh grew louder, and it reached down, its fingers, if they could even be called fingers, reaching for me. Its skin was black as pitch, slick and unnatural, like the surface of an oil spill. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I had ever seen. "Sarah," the voice hissed, "I have watched this land for centuries, and I will watch it for centuries more. You cannot escape. You never could." I opened my mouth to scream, but the words never came. It was as though the very air was choking me. The weight of the creature's presence crushed down on me, and I felt as though I was drowning in darkness. But then, a sudden flash of light, a flicker in the distance. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure, someone, anyone standing at the entrance of the church. A human form. I blinked, trying to focus, but before I could make out who it was, the light vanished. The creature stopped. Its massive form paused as if sensing something. A change in the atmosphere. I could feel the shift, the sense of dread growing stronger as something or someone moved closer. And then I saw it. In the doorway stood an old man. His appearance was faint, almost like a ghost, his features blurry, but I knew who he was. He was the one from the journal, the one who had written about the ritual, about the demon, the one who had made the original deal with the creature. "You're too late," the demon whispered, its voice full of malice. "The blood has already been spilled." But the old man didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the creature with an expression I couldn't quite place. It was neither fearful nor triumphant. It was something else entirely, resignation perhaps, or maybe regret. "You cannot take her," the old man said, his voice thin but steady. "Not yet," the creature hissed, its form convulsing in anger. "You think you can stop me, old man? You are nothing. Your time is over." The man raised a hand, and in an instant, the air around us seemed to hum. The ground beneath our feet trembled, and a blinding light erupted from the old man's hand, enveloping the creature in a brilliant flash. But the light didn't last long. It flickered and waned, like a candle being blown out by a cold wind. The creature howled in fury, its massive form writhing, but the light had done its work. The creature staggered back, its body slowly dissolving into shadow. I couldn't understand what was happening. The old man was still there, standing in the doorway, but he wasn't fighting the demon anymore. The demon, it was retreating, not defeated, but contained once again. The old man looked at me, and I could see it now in his eyes. The regret, the sorrow. He had made the deal with the demon long ago, and now, after all these years, it had come back to collect. "It will never end," he whispered. "Not until the blood is spilled. You have sealed your town's fate. Every year, someone must die. It is the price for the harvest." With that, the light around him faded, and the old man was gone. The creature's laughter filled the air once more, and I knew it was true. The cycle would continue. Raven's Hollow was doomed to repeat its dark history, bound to the land by the blood that had been spilled. And as I stumbled out of the church, the weight of it all hit me. There was no escape. I staggered out of the church, the chilling laughter of the demon still echoing in my mind. My heart pounded in my chest, and I had to fight against the urge to collapse, to just give in to the overwhelming exhaustion and fear. I had no idea where I was going. I just needed to get away, to find somewhere safe. But the streets of Raven's Hollow felt foreign to me now, like they were shifting under my feet, like the very ground had turned against me. I thought of my family, of my parents, my little brother, my friends. I couldn't imagine what they were going through. The town was on the brink of the harvest festival. The whole town would be gathered in the square, preparing to celebrate, unaware of the horror that lurked beneath the surface. The demon was still bound to the land, but it wasn't truly gone. It was like a curse that had woven itself into the very fabric of Raven's Hollow, and I knew now that it was only a matter of time before it demanded another life. I couldn't help but remember the old man's words, the final whisper that haunted me. Every year, someone must die. It is the price for the harvest. The full weight of his words sank in like a stone in my stomach. The cycle hadn't been broken. It couldn't be. I had failed. The ritual I tried to perform, it wasn't enough. It had only been a half measure. The demon, though contained, was still bound to the town, its hunger unsatisfied. The blood would flow again, as it always had. I ran through the streets, desperately searching for someone, anyone, who could help. I thought about Mia, trapped inside that demonic vessel. Was she even still alive? Had the demon taken her completely, or was there a chance, no, a prayer, that she could be saved? I turned the corner toward the town square. The harvest festival was already in full swing, the sounds of laughter, music, and shouting filling the air. People were gathered around the booths, celebrating as if nothing was wrong, as if everything was normal. But it wasn't. I could feel it in my bones. The air was too thick, too heavy. There was a palpable tension in the atmosphere, a sense that something terrible was about to happen. But they couldn't feel it. They couldn't see it. I froze for a moment in the shadows, hidden from sight. There, in the center of the square, stood a figure I recognized. Mia. She was standing there, but she wasn't herself. Her body was rigid, her face expressionless. Her eyes, those eyes, were empty, as though all the life had been drained from her. She was an empty shell, nothing but a puppet for whatever dark force had taken her. And behind her, I could see something else, something moving in the shadows. The demon was watching. It was there, hidden in the darkness, biding its time. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The demon had made its move. It was about to claim its sacrifice. I couldn't just stand there. I couldn't let it happen. Not again. But I was too late. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, and before I could make a move, the sound of chanting began to rise, low and steady. It started quietly, like whispers in the wind, but then it grew louder, more pronounced, until it was a full-on roar of voices, all of them chanting in unison. I looked around, panic surging through me. The townspeople, everyone, even those I knew, had gathered in a circle around Mia. Their faces were vacant, their eyes blank, and I realized with a sickening certainty that they were all under the demon's control. It was happening again. The harvest was about to begin. I rushed forward, pushing past the crowd, desperate to reach Mia. My legs burned from the effort, but my fear pushed me onward. I had to stop this. I had to save her. But as I approached, something stopped me. A figure emerged from the crowd. It was the sheriff. I had seen him around town for years, always with a stern look, but now his expression was different. Hollow, empty, as though he was no longer the man I once knew. His eyes were wide, too wide, and his face was pale, almost sickly, as though he had aged years in a matter of days. He stepped in front of me, blocking my path. "You're too late," he said, his voice hollow and cold. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. What are you talking about? The deal's been made, he continued, his tone distant, like he was speaking from far away. You can't stop it now. You never could. I could feel the panic building, threatening to overwhelm me. No, I can stop it. I have to stop it. There has to be something we can do. But the sheriff just shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. It's already been written. The price has been paid. The blood must flow. Behind him, I could see the demon's form looming in the shadows. It was watching, waiting, its massive, shadowy figure stretching across the town square. It wasn't done yet. It wasn't finished. The hunger hadn't been sated. And then, without warning, a loud, piercing scream split the air. The sound came from Mia. I whipped my head around, my heart stopping in my chest. Mia's body was writhing, her limbs contorting in unnatural ways as the demon took hold of her once more. The chanting grew louder, more frantic, as the townspeople, now under the full control of the demon, began to move in unison. They stepped forward, slowly, like a wave moving toward its inevitable crash. The sacrifice was about to be made. I didn't think, I just acted. I bolted forward, shoving past the sheriff, who barely seemed to notice as I rushed to Mia's side. I reached out, grabbing her arm, pulling her toward me. Mia, I screamed. Snap out of it. But she didn't respond. Her eyes were glazed, unseeing, and I could feel the heat radiating from her skin, as though she were burning from the inside out. Then, from behind me, I heard the demon's voice, deep, rumbling, and full of malice. You cannot stop me. This town belongs to me. The harvest is mine. I turned to face the creature, my body trembling in fear. The demon was there, standing behind the crowd, its dark form twisting and writhing as though it was part of the shadows themselves. I knew what had to be done. It had always been part of the cycle. There was no escaping it. The town was bound to the demon, and it always had been. But this time, I wasn't going to be the one to pay the price. I had to stop it. I reached into my pocket, where I had hidden the journal I'd found, the one with the ritual, the one that might still have a chance to save us. The words were blurry in my hands, but I held them tight, clutching them to my chest. I started chanting, reading aloud the words I had memorized. The ground beneath me trembled as the air grew thick with power. The demon shrieked, its form flickering, warping, as though it were in agony. But it was too late. The demon's grip on the town was already slipping. The people began to move, their eyes blinking, their consciousness slowly returning. And as the last of the chanting words left my lips, I felt a surge of energy, pure, unrelenting. The demon screamed, the sound echoing through the square, as its form began to dissipate, breaking apart like smoke in the wind. But as it disappeared, it left behind one last chilling message. You can't stop the cycle. It will return, and next time, there will be no escape. The harvest festival came to an abrupt halt. The people who had been under the demon's control stood still, their eyes wide, blinking in confusion as if they had just woken from a long, dark dream. But it didn't matter. The damage had already been done. As I looked around at the people of Raven's Hollow, I knew that this place, this cursed town, was never truly free. The demon was gone for now, but it would return. It always would. The price had been paid, but the cycle had not been broken. And in the silence that followed, I realized the truth. Every year, someone would die. It was the price for the harvest, and Raven's Hollow would never escape its dark legacy. Not now. Not ever. It was too late for all of us. Story 2. The Haunted Marionette of Shadyside by Lucas E. A. It was the fog that made Shadyside different. No one could explain it, not the locals and not the visitors. It wasn't your typical mist that would disappear by midday. It hung thick in the air, clinging to everything, even in broad daylight. And there was something about the town, a kind of weight in the atmosphere. You could feel it when you walked through, like the whole place was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I was young then, just a kid, around 12. My family had just moved into Shadyside a few months before. My mom always joked that we had the worst luck when it came to finding places to live, but for some reason, this one stuck. Maybe it was because of my sister, Emily. She was everything to me, especially after our dad left. It was just the two of us, always close, always together. And then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. It happened suddenly, in a car accident that I don't even like to talk about. Emily was the kind of person who always had a smile, a laugh that was contagious, but when she died, it was like the life in the whole town drained out. No one spoke of it. It's like it never happened. The day of the accident was the last time I saw her smile. And after that, nothing seemed right. So, when the circus rolled into town a few weeks later, I wasn't interested. Who wants to go see a circus in a place like Shadyside? The idea of the whole thing seemed off. The posters they put up around town were torn and faded, showing images of the performers, most of whom were ghostly pale and almost too perfect, if that makes sense. But one thing caught my eye. The circus was offering a show featuring marionettes, puppets that looked so lifelike. They could have passed for real people. I didn't think much of it at first, but one night, after weeks of my mom trying to get me out of the house, I decided to go check it out. I don't remember much about that first night. All I recall is the smell of burning wood and popcorn, the creak of the circus tents in the breeze, and the odd feeling that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't until the marionette show started that I began to feel strange. The moment the curtain rose, I saw them. The puppets. They were placed in a circle, sitting perfectly still, each one dressed in costumes so intricately detailed that they looked like they could jump off their stands and walk right out of the tent. At first, I thought they were just that, puppets, lifeless, moved by the puppeteer behind the scenes. But then I saw her. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but no, I couldn't be mistaken. The marionette sitting at the center of the stage looked exactly like Emily. Her hair, her eyes, her smile, all captured in the face of this puppet. It was her. The same expression she wore the last time I saw her. I didn't know how, but it was like she was there, staring right at me. The rest of the show passed in a blur, my mind spinning and my heart racing. I don't remember how I left the tent, but somehow I found myself standing outside, unable to move. The air had grown heavier, and the fog was thick, almost suffocating. I kept thinking about that puppet, about how it couldn't just be a coincidence. But if it wasn't a coincidence, then what was it? The next few days felt like a blur, and I couldn't stop thinking about the circus, about that puppet. I couldn't shake the image of Emily's face staring back at me, like she was trapped in that thing, and I needed to know why. That's when I started to sneak out at night, slipping away from my mom's watchful eyes, going back to the circus. Every night, I sat in the same spot, hoping to see the puppet again, hoping to understand why it looked so much like her. It was on the fourth night that I noticed something new. There was an old woman sitting a few rows ahead of me. She had silver hair, thin and wiry, and she seemed to be watching the puppets with an intensity that unnerved me. After the show ended, I followed her as she walked toward the back of the circus, toward the old, decaying theater where the performers lived and practiced. I didn't know why I did it. Maybe it was because of the strange feeling that had been growing inside me since that first show. Maybe it was because I needed answers. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I followed her through the back gate, into the shadowy, forgotten parts of the circus that no one else dared to enter. That's when I saw it. The marionettes weren't just puppets. They were alive. Not in the way you might think. No, they weren't just strings and wood. They were something else. The moment I stepped into the darkness of the backstage area, I felt it, an oppressive weight, like the walls themselves were closing in. I watched as the woman approached one of the puppets and began speaking to it, her voice low and urgent. I couldn't hear all of her words, but I heard enough to understand. "These children are trapped," she whispered. "Victor doesn't just make puppets. He steals souls." I froze. I didn't know what to do. But the woman turned to me, her eyes wide with recognition. She had seen me following her, and there was no hiding the fear in her eyes. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice trembling. "It's not safe. If he finds out." I didn't get to hear the rest of her warning because, just then, I heard a voice behind me. Cold, commanding, almost hypnotic. "Why are you here?" It was him. The man who controlled the circus. The man who created the marionettes. I didn't know his name yet, but I would soon. His eyes were cold, dead almost, and his face was gaunt, almost as if life had been drained from him years ago. He was standing in the doorway of one of the back rooms, watching me with an unsettling calm. Before I could react, the woman grabbed my arm and pulled me away, whispering frantically, "You need to leave. Now, before it's too late." But I couldn't leave. Not yet. I needed to know what had happened to Emily, what had happened to all those children, and why they were here, trapped in the bodies of lifeless puppets. The old woman led me deeper into the circus's forgotten parts, past rows of puppets locked behind glass cases. Some of them were old, covered in dust, their eyes hollow. Others were fresh, newer. But it was when we reached a dark corner of the backstage that I saw something that made my blood run cold. In a cage, in the farthest corner of the room, was Emily's marionette. She was sitting perfectly still, her glassy eyes staring straight ahead, her face frozen in that same haunting expression. It was her. I knew it. I could see it in the details, the way her hair was styled, the clothes she wore, the faint scar on her cheek. But this wasn't my sister anymore. This was a puppet, a vessel, a prisoner. And that's when I realized the truth. Victor, the man who ran the circus, had been taking children. He was trapping their souls in these puppets, turning them into lifeless shells. And now, Emily was one of them. The woman told me more. How Victor had been using the souls of the missing children to animate his creations. How he'd been doing it for decades. And how, no matter what, once a soul was taken, it could never truly be freed. But there was one thing that could stop him. As I stood there, staring at Emily's lifeless form, a thought occurred to me. What if I destroyed the puppet? What if I destroyed the thing holding her soul? Could she be freed? Or would she remain trapped forever, like all the others? I didn't know, but I couldn't let her stay there. Not like that. And that's when I made my decision. I felt my heart thumping in my chest as I stared at Emily's puppet, unable to tear my eyes away. The glassy stare, the frozen expression, it was her. But it wasn't. I could see her smile and the tilt of the head, the way her hair fell just right. Things only I would know. But underneath, it was all wrong. The lifelessness, the stillness, it made my skin crawl. The old woman didn't say a word. She was watching me closely, her face tight with worry, as if she knew what I was thinking. The air in the room was thick, suffocating. I could feel a presence. It was like the walls themselves were watching me, waiting, and I had the undeniable feeling that if I made the wrong move, something terrible would happen. The woman spoke first, her voice soft but urgent. "You have to understand, once a soul is captured, it's gone. Destroying the puppet, it won't bring her back. She's trapped inside, and there's no escaping that." She looked away, her eyes shadowed by a deep fear. "But you can stop him. You can stop Victor." I swallowed hard. How do I stop him? My voice cracked, and I hated how weak I sounded. I wasn't a kid anymore, not really. But in that moment, I felt like the scared little boy who had lost everything. The woman took a deep breath, the lines on her face tightening as if she was reliving something terrible. Victor, he's not just a puppeteer. He's the one who controls them. All the souls are trapped in the marionettes, but Victor, he's the one who makes them move. He can't do it without their souls, and he's been using them for years. Hundreds of children, hundreds of souls, all captured. Why? Why is he doing this? I asked, barely able to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. Why my sister? She shook her head slowly, her voice trembling. Victor's been around for longer than you can imagine. He doesn't just trap souls to create puppets. He's been using them for power. It's how he stays alive. The souls feed him, give him strength. They keep him young, keep him in control. That's why no one ever notices how strange the circus is, how strange he is. The longer the puppets stay, the stronger he becomes. I was starting to piece it together. The fog and shady side, the way time seemed to stand still here. The people in the town, the way they never seemed to age, always looked hollow. It was all tied together. The circus wasn't just a show, it was a prison for the souls of the town's children. And Victor was feeding on them. Then, if I destroy the puppet, I stop him? I asked, a glimmer of hope beginning to flicker inside me. I wasn't sure if I believed it, but it was the only thing I had left to hold on to. The old woman gave me a sad smile. It's not that simple. Victor's power is tied to the puppets, and the moment you try to destroy one of them, he'll know. He'll come after you, and he won't stop. He'll make sure no one ever remembers what happened here. Her voice dropped to a whisper. But if you're determined, there's one thing you can do. There's one way to end it. I looked at her, eager for any kind of answer. What do I need to do? She stepped closer, lowering her voice as if someone might be listening. You need to destroy Victor. If you destroy the one who controls the marionettes, the curse will break. But you need to be careful. He's more powerful than you think. And once you make your move, there's no turning back. The room felt colder, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. I stared at Emily's puppet again, my heart aching in my chest. I had to do something. I couldn't let her stay trapped like that. Couldn't let the rest of the children suffer the same fate. I had no choice. The old woman led me deeper into the circus's bowels, past more puppets, some still in their glass cases, some halfway out of their stands, their eyes following me like they were aware of my every step. It was like the air itself was charged with something dark and ancient. I tried to push the fear out of my mind, focusing on the goal. We're close, she murmured, and I followed her without another word. The back room was a maze, filled with cluttered shelves of strings, broken puppets, and empty, discarded costumes. But in the center of it all was a large wooden door, warped and cracked with age. The woman stopped in front of it, her face pale. "This is where Victor resides," she said, almost to herself. "But you won't be able to just walk in. He'll know you're coming the second you cross the threshold." My hands were shaking, my heart pounding. I had to face him, the man who had stolen my sister and so many others. The man who had been feeding off their souls for years. I was ready to face whatever it took. The old woman handed me a small, rusted key. "You'll need this. But remember what I said. Once you go in, there's no going back. You may never be the same again." I took the key from her, my fingers cold and trembling, then walked toward the door. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the narrow hall. I knew the moment I stepped through, there would be no turning back. But I was beyond caring. I inserted the key into the lock, the metal scraping against the old wood. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. Victor's lair was exactly what I imagined it would be, dark, oppressive, and filled with the faint smell of decay. The room was cluttered with shelves upon shelves of marionettes, their glassy eyes all staring at me. The only light came from a dim, flickering lantern hanging in the far corner. And there, standing in the center of the room, was Victor. His face was pale, almost sickly, with hollow cheeks and dark, sunken eyes. He was dressed in an old, tattered coat, and there was a strange, almost unnatural stillness to his movements. It was as if time didn't affect him. He didn't even blink. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice a rasp, like dry leaves rustling in the wind. I couldn't speak. The sight of him, of everything I had learned, made me sick to my stomach. He was the monster, the one who had stolen so many lives, so many souls. And now he was standing in front of me, waiting. "I'm going to end this," I said, my voice shaking, but I was determined. Victor's lips curled into a smile that made my blood run cold. "You think you can stop me? You think you can destroy what I've built?" His eyes glinted with something dark, something ancient. "You're nothing but a child. And once I'm done with you, you'll be just another soul to add to my collection." His voice was hypnotic, pulling me in, but I fought it. I couldn't let him win. I couldn't let him take any more lives. With trembling hands, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, sharp knife I had grabbed from the kitchen before I left the house. It was the only thing I had. Victor's eyes widened when he saw the blade, and he took a step forward, but before he could react, I lunged. I slashed at him, but he was too quick. He moved with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for someone so still. He grabbed my wrist with an iron grip, twisting it until the knife fell to the floor. "Fool," he hissed, his breath hot against my face. "You think you can stop me with a mere knife?" But in that moment, I realized something. Victor wasn't invincible. He was just a man, one whose power relied on the souls he trapped. The key to stopping him wasn't in destroying him physically, it was in destroying the source of his power. The puppets. With every ounce of strength I had left, I broke free from his grip and grabbed a nearby marionette, the one that looked like Emily. Without hesitation, I ripped it from its stand and threw it to the ground. As soon as it hit the floor, the room shook. The walls cracked. Victor screamed, his body convulsing in a way that no human body should. But even then, I couldn't stop. I grabbed another puppet, then another, tearing them apart, throwing them to the ground. Each time I did, the room shook more violently, and the eerie whispers of the trapped souls began to rise. And then it happened. Victor collapsed to his knees, his body writhing, as the last puppet, Emily's, fell apart in my hands. His scream was deafening, and the ground beneath us cracked open, a dark, swirling energy rising from the depths of the earth. But it wasn't over. Not yet. As the circus burned to the ground, I thought the curse was broken. The souls had been freed. But I was wrong. The marionettes, those lifeless dolls, rose up, now human, their eyes wide and empty. And among them was Emily. I couldn't breathe. My legs wobbled beneath me as I stumbled backward, heart hammering in my chest. It wasn't just the sound of fire cracking or the blinding light that had engulfed the circus tent. It wasn't the smoke filling the air or the harsh, suffocating heat that bit at my skin. It was the eyes, the empty, soulless eyes of the children, of my sister, now standing before me, free of their marionette shells, but still wearing the hollow faces of the souls they once held. I looked at Emily's face, but it wasn't her anymore. She was staring at me, but her eyes were cold, glazed over with something far darker than anything I had ever known. She took a step forward, and the others followed. Their movements were jerky, like marionettes, but they were no longer controlled by strings. They were walking on their own, alive in a way that defied reason, yet still bound to something broken. El Lucas. Her voice was a whisper, but it carried the weight of 1,000 unsaid words. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but my legs wouldn't move. My sister was right there. She was alive again. But the warmth, the humanity, the love that had once defined her, it was gone. The others, the children who had been trapped for years, shuffled behind her, all of them in various stages of deterioration. Some were thin and gaunt, their clothes ragged. Others looked untouched by time, like they had only just fallen from the stage. But their faces, they were nothing like the innocent faces of the children they once were. They were hungry, hungry for something more than just revenge. They were hungry for life. My life. Victor's body, still twitching violently, was lying motionless on the floor behind them. The cursed puppeteer had been consumed by his own creation, but in his fall, he had inadvertently set loose something far more dangerous. His puppets were now free, free to roam, free to seek the very thing they had been denied: revenge. Emily's ghostly voice broke through my spiraling thoughts. You freed us, Lucas, but you don't understand. We're not free. She reached out her hand, her fingers skeletal and trembling. We're trapped here, just like you. I shook my head, panic rising in my throat. No, you can't be. You were my sister. You're supposed to be in heaven. You. I couldn't finish. The air felt too thick. The town outside was burning. The fire was spreading, consuming everything in its path. But inside this cursed tent, there was only an eerie stillness, like the world had stopped turning. Emily's eyes flickered to the others. The children who had been taken, who had once laughed and played under the circus tents, now stood behind her, no longer the joyful faces they once were. Each of them had their own story, their own lost lives. But now, their memories had been replaced by something darker, something far more desperate. We weren't meant to be alive, Lucas, Emily whispered. We were supposed to be kept. The air around her seemed to grow colder, the edges of her form blurring like a fading dream. Victor kept us, but now we're lost. And so are you. You freed us. But the curse never ends. I backed up, my mind racing. What was she saying? I had freed them. I had ended the circus. The fire was taking care of it all, right? But why didn't it feel like it? Why didn't it feel like victory? A child, another marionette, stepped forward. His face was familiar, but his eyes, there was no recognition there. He wasn't just a lost soul anymore. He was a predator now, like the others. His mouth twitched into a grin, sharp and unsettling. You think they're gone? You think you fixed everything? No, Lucas. His voice was twisted, echoing with something primal, something horrifying. We were trapped, yes, but now we're alive. He stepped forward, and I could see his fingers twitching, claws now, not fingers. The others followed suit. The fog outside the tent thickened, curling inward like it had a mind of its own, a suffocating presence that swallowed the light. It felt like the town itself was closing in, as if Shadyside had become a prison for all of us. The people who had been too blind to see the truth before were starting to notice something was wrong. I could hear them, distant, fading voices shouting in confusion, the realization that something terrible had been unleashed. I glanced back at Emily, her face still locked in that expression of pain, her eyes now hollow like the others, full of rage, but something else too. Hunger. Her gaze flicked to the others, and a dark thought crawled into my mind. They weren't just seeking revenge anymore. They were consuming what they had lost. They wanted life, and they wanted it now. You should have left, Lucas, Emily said, her voice heavy with something unnatural. Now we're all part of the same curse. The fire may burn the circus down, but it will never burn away what Victor created. It will never burn away the hunger. A cold wind howled through the shattered walls of the tent. The flames outside flickered, casting long shadows on the walls of the circus, making the marionette's movements seem even more twisted. The fire was consuming the building, yes, but it couldn't touch the curse, the thing that had been binding them all for years. It was alive now, feeding off the souls it had captured. I turned and ran, my feet carrying me without thought, propelled by panic and desperation. The town of Shadyside was no longer a town. It was a hollow shell, burning from the inside out. I could hear the children's footsteps behind me, the sound of their unholy march closing in. I ran through the fog, past the ruins of the circus, but I couldn't outrun the feeling that was chasing me. Their eyes, their hollow eyes, followed me, taunting me, just out of sight but always there. I found the old road that led out of town, the one that curved around the hill. But as I reached the end, I saw the truth. The fog was thickening, not just around the circus, but over the entire town. And the townspeople who had once been so normal, they were changing. Their faces were warped, just like the marionettes, their eyes vacant and dead. And in that moment, I understood what Emily had meant. The curse of the marionettes had never been truly broken. It had simply evolved. The souls that had been trapped were now free, but they were free in a way that was far worse. They walked among the living, their bodies no longer puppets but vessels, and they weren't done. Not by a long shot. They were still hungry. They still wanted more. I could feel their eyes on me, even as I turned to flee. They were everywhere now, lurking in the fog, blending into the shadows of the burning town. The marionettes had won. The circus was gone, but the souls of the dead children, my sister included, would never be at rest. I heard the footsteps coming closer, too many to count. I was never going to escape. I had freed them, yes, but in doing so, I had become one of them. Their hunger would never be satisfied. As I ran, I realized with sickening clarity that Shadyside would never be the same, and neither would I. The marionettes might have burned, but their souls, their hunger, would always remain, and there was no escaping that. Story 3. The Whispers of Birchwood by Evan Parker. It seemed like the perfect escape, a quiet little town away from the noise and stress of city life. My wife, Emily, and I were exhausted by the constant rush of the city. We'd been looking for somewhere peaceful to raise our young son, Ethan, and when we found Birchwood, it felt like a sign. Birchwood wasn't much of a town, but it had its charm. It was small, almost too small, and nestled between thick woods. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, but there's a quiet comfort in that. It's the kind of town that makes you feel like nothing could possibly go wrong, like you're in some sort of bubble. We were drawn to an old house at the very edge of town, right on the outskirts, near a forgotten graveyard. It was a Victorian-style building that looked like it had been standing for centuries. It was run down, sure, but that just added to its character. The price was right too, almost too good to be true. When we asked around, everyone was polite, but there was an unease in their responses, like they were trying not to tell us something. Still, we didn't let that stop us. We were desperate for a change. We didn't need much, just a place to live in peace. A fresh start. The house was perfect, or so we thought. I remember the day we moved in. It was overcast with the kind of gray sky that makes everything feel heavier. The air felt thick. Maybe it was the weight of change, or maybe it was something else. But I swear, there was an odd stillness in the air as we unloaded the truck. At first, everything was fine. The house was old, sure, but it had character. We spent the first few days unpacking and getting to know the place. It was cold inside, even though it was summer. We figured it was just the old pipes and the way the house was built. But then strange things started happening. I don't know when it first started, but I began hearing whispers. Soft at first, like a draft, but as the days passed, they grew louder. I thought I was just tired, maybe a bit stressed from the move, but Emily heard them too. At night, we'd both be lying in bed, and there'd be this strange sound, almost like murmurs, but they weren't quite words. It was as though something was trying to speak, but couldn't quite get it out. It would come from the walls, or sometimes from the floorboards. I'd lie there, frozen, trying to make sense of it. But the whispers would always stop before I could understand them. I tried to brush it off. Maybe the house was just settling. Old houses creak. But Emily wasn't so sure. She started getting more and more nervous. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, staring at the walls, like she was listening for something. "What do you think it is?" she'd ask me, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer, and that bothered me more than I cared to admit. What was it? It wasn't just the noises that unsettled us. Over time, we began to notice things that didn't feel right. Shadows in the house that moved, not with the natural flow of light, but in ways that didn't make sense. They didn't stay still. They shifted when they shouldn't have. I'd turn a corner, and for a split second, I'd see something in the corner of my eye, a figure standing, then gone in an instant. But every time I looked, there was nothing there. Emily and I began avoiding certain rooms. The attic, for one. It wasn't that it was creepy, well, maybe it was, but there was something about it that felt off, like it was holding its breath. We had planned to clean it out when we first moved in, but neither of us was in a hurry. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I'll never forget the day I decided to go up there. I was alone at home. Emily had taken Ethan to the park, and I figured it was time to face whatever was up there. I went up with a flashlight, and the first thing I noticed was the cold. It hit me like a wave as soon as I stepped through the trapdoor. I shivered and pulled my jacket tighter around me. The attic was small, filled with old furniture, boxes, and other forgotten things. But there was something else, too, something I couldn't put my finger on. It wasn't just the dust or the smell of mildew. There was a sense of presence, and then I saw it, an old, tattered journal, hidden behind a stack of old photo albums. It looked out of place, like it had been intentionally left behind. I picked it up, and as I flipped through the pages, I couldn't make sense of what I was reading. It was a journal, yes, but the entries were strange. They were written in a frantic scrawl, like the author had been desperate to record something before they lost their grip on reality. The more I read, the more I began to feel sick to my stomach. It wasn't until I got to the last few pages that I saw something that made my blood run cold. A list of names. My name was on that list. I didn't know what to make of it at first. Was it some weird coincidence? But as I read further, the entries began to mention the town, Birchwood, and the house. The orphanage that once stood here, the children that disappeared, and the dark history that no one talked about. The more I read, the more I understood. The house had a past, one that no one was willing to discuss. And then, as if the weight of the discovery wasn't enough, something happened that made everything feel real. The whispers returned. Only this time, they weren't in the walls. They were in my head. "Help us." That's all they said. At first, I thought it was a trick of my mind. But no, I could hear them, clear as day. They were calling to me. And when I looked around the attic, the shadows were shifting again, moving with purpose. I dropped the journal and ran, but it didn't stop there. When I got home that night, Emily was waiting for me. She had this look on her face, the kind of look a person gets when they know something you don't. "You found it, didn't you?" she asked. I didn't need to say anything. She had heard it too. That night, after everything that happened in the attic, I couldn't sleep. Emily and I sat in the living room, the flickering light from the lamp casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. Ethan was in bed, thankfully unaware of the chaos unfolding around us. Emily was quiet, but I could see the unease in her eyes. She had that look again, the one she had when she asked me if I'd found something. I didn't know what to say. "I'm not crazy, am I?" I asked her, hoping she'd tell me it was all just stress from the move, from the change. But I could tell, by the way she hesitated, that she was starting to believe the same things I was. "I don't know anymore," she said, voice low. "But we need to leave, Mark. This place, it's not right. There's something wrong with it." I wanted to believe it was just paranoia, that everything would be okay. But there was a weight in her voice that made my stomach twist. There was no going back now. I knew it. We both did. We were stuck in this house. We went to bed that night with the unsettling knowledge that things weren't just odd. They were dangerous. The next morning, I woke up to a chill in the air, despite it being another sweltering summer day outside. The house felt cold, unnaturally cold. I tried to brush it off, thinking the old house was just acting up again. But when I walked downstairs, I saw something that made my blood freeze. The front door was open. Now, I'm not one to jump to conclusions, but Emily and I were both pretty careful about locking the doors at night. It was an old house, after all. The last thing we needed was a break-in. But there it was, standing wide open, like someone had left it that way on purpose. I immediately went to check on Ethan, my heart pounding in my chest. He was still asleep in his room, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing in from all sides. I checked the whole house, from top to bottom. Every door, every window, everything was locked tight. But still, there was something off about the atmosphere. I felt watched, like something or someone was waiting. I walked into the living room, and there, on the coffee table, was the journal I had found in the attic. It was open. The pages had flipped by themselves, and it wasn't just random pages. It was open to the last entry, the one where the voices had written my name. But now there was something else. At the bottom of the page was a new entry. We're waiting. We need you to listen. We need your help to escape. The words were scrawled hastily, smeared in places like the ink had been applied too quickly. And there, at the bottom, was a sketch. It was hard to make out, but the more I looked at it, the clearer it became. It was a drawing of the house. But it wasn't just a picture of the house. No, it was a diagram, with rooms marked off, and symbols I didn't recognize. And then it hit me. This wasn't just a house. This place, this home, was more like a prison. A cage. Mark, Emily's voice interrupted my thoughts, her voice trembling. I turned to look at her, and her face was pale. She was staring at the staircase, her eyes wide with terror. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice strained. I saw something, she whispered, in the hallway. It moved. I thought it was Ethan, but when I looked again, it wasn't him. I felt my throat go dry. I walked slowly to the hallway, every step feeling like it took hours. But there was nothing there, just the dark wood of the hallway stretching out before me. I stood there for a long time, waiting, listening, but all I could hear was my own breath. It wasn't until later that afternoon, when things took a much darker turn. The whispers began again, but this time, they weren't just faint murmurs in the walls. They were coming from everywhere. They filled the house like a constant hum, like static on a broken radio, only louder, almost intelligible. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a voice, many voices, and they were all calling out to us. We had to leave, I knew it. We had no choice. This house, it wasn't just haunted. It wasn't just old. It was a trap, a dark place, one that had something evil buried beneath the floorboards. And whatever it wasn't going to let us leave. I grabbed Emily, and we went straight to the car, but when we tried to leave, something strange happened. The driveway was blocked, not by anything physical. There was nothing there, but the car wouldn't start. It wasn't just that the engine was dead. It felt like the whole car was locked in place. I couldn't get it to move, no matter what I did. Panic began to settle in. The house was alive, I realized. It didn't want us to leave. It needed us. That's when Ethan came running out of the house, his small face pale and full of fear. "Daddy, Mommy," he said in a shaky voice. "There's something in my room, something in the walls." I felt a wave of dread wash over me. I ran inside, and that's when I saw it. There was a crack in the wall in Ethan's room, but it wasn't just a crack. It was growing. I couldn't explain it. It was like the wall was pulling itself apart, stretching, bending, and from within the crack came a sound, a low, guttural hum. like something trying to break through. "Mom, get Ethan," I shouted, panic rising in my chest. But it was too late. The walls around us seemed to close in, like the house was tightening its grip. The whispers became frantic, louder, more insistent. I could hear my name now, clear as day, over and over again like a chant. "Mark, help us please." I don't know how long we stood there, paralyzed, but I knew we couldn't stay any longer. I had to find a way out. That's when I remembered the journal, the ritual. I had dismissed it at first, but now it felt like the only option. I ran back to the attic and pulled the journal from the pile. There was a passage in the back in the last few pages that described a ritual, something that could, at least temporarily, free the spirits trapped in the house. It was risky though, dangerous, but I didn't have a choice. I grabbed everything I needed and ran back to the living room. Emily and Ethan were there, standing by the door. They looked terrified. "We have to do it now," I said, my voice desperate. "It's our only chance." The ritual wasn't complicated, but it required specific actions: burning candles, chanting words in a language I didn't understand, and placing symbols around the house. As we worked, the house seemed to shake. The whispers intensified, growing louder, more desperate. It was like the house itself was screaming at us, trying to stop us. But we kept going. We had no choice. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the house fell silent. For a few seconds, it was calm. The tension in the air lifted, and I thought we had succeeded. The spirits were gone. We were free. But then it came back. The whispers returned, louder than ever, and this time, it was clear. "We're here," they said, "and now, you're one of us." The room grew colder again, the same biting chill we'd felt when we first moved in. But this time, it wasn't just the temperature, it was the feeling. The air was thick, like something was pressing down on us from all sides, suffocating us. I couldn't breathe. I didn't want to breathe. It felt like the house was drawing in a deep, slow breath, preparing to consume. I turned to Emily, my heart racing, my hands trembling. Her face was pale, her eyes wide in terror, but I saw something else too, recognition. She knew this feeling. She'd felt it before. I could see it in the way her hands shook as she gripped Ethan tightly, pulling him closer to her. "I knew it. I knew we didn't escape," she whispered, her voice breaking. The whispers had started again, but they weren't like before. They were different now, darker, angrier, smarter. It wasn't just random voices calling out to us. This time, they were speaking to us directly, calling us by name, telling us things no one should know. "Mark, we're here, waiting. You can't leave now." I gripped the journal tightly. The pages of the ritual still crumpled from my frantic hands. The candles we'd lit burned low, their flames flickering wildly, as though caught in an unseen wind. There was no breeze in the room, yet everything moved as if the house itself was alive, breathing with us. I looked down at the symbols we'd drawn on the floor, the chalk lines still faint but clearly visible. The ritual was supposed to keep the spirits trapped, at least for a time, but now, it felt as though it had only served to release something worse. The words in the journal seemed to echo in my head, like a warning I hadn't heard before. Do not disturb the past. Do not try to remove the spirits, or they will claim you as their own. I swallowed hard, a cold sweat beading on my forehead. We had messed up. We had tried to do something we didn't fully understand, something far beyond our control. And now, the spirits were here, and we were trapped with them. Suddenly, the walls groaned. It was a low, reverberating sound, like the house was shifting, stretching, as if it were alive. The floor beneath us creaked, and I saw the cracks widening, slithering like veins through the wood. The lights flickered again, this time with a suddenness that made my stomach churn. The shadows on the walls began to move. They weren't just shadows anymore. The shapes that danced across the walls were no longer fleeting or vague. They were real, dark, elongated figures that stretched out, reaching toward us, like they wanted to crawl out of the walls. And I swear I could see eyes, hundreds of them, glowing in the dark corners, watching us, following our every movement. "Mommy, Daddy," Ethan whimpered, clutching onto Emily as if his life depended on it. I felt a rush of panic. What was happening? Why were they back? Why hadn't the ritual worked? A sudden crash from upstairs snapped me out of my thoughts. The sound of furniture toppling, the thud of something heavy hitting the floor. It was like the house itself was throwing a tantrum. But I didn't need to see it to know what was happening. I could feel it. "Stay here," I told Emily, my voice trembling but firm. "I'll go check. Don't let him out of your sight." I don't know why I said it. There was no reason for me to go upstairs. But I had to know what was happening. I had to face it. I walked slowly up the stairs, the wood creaking beneath my feet. Every step felt like it echoed for miles in the silence that had swallowed the house. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat louder than the last, until it seemed like it was the only sound I could hear. I reached the top of the stairs. The hallway stretched out before me in an oppressive darkness. The only light came from the flickering candles below, casting strange, contorted shadows on the walls. As I moved toward Ethan's room, I could feel the temperature drop, colder than it had ever been. The air was thick with the smell of something damp, something rotting. I reached the door to Ethan's room, my hand shaking as I gripped the knob. But before I could open it, I heard it. A voice. "Don't go in there." It was soft, a whisper, almost familiar, but it wasn't Emily's voice. It wasn't anyone I recognized. I hesitated, my hand frozen on the doorknob. But the voice repeated itself, this time louder, more urgent. "Mark, don't go in." I backed away from the door, my breath shallow, my mind spinning. Something wasn't right. I could feel it. Something was wrong with Ethan's room. But what was it? What was waiting for me behind that door? I turned around and raced back downstairs, my pulse racing in my ears. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a mistake, that I had just narrowly avoided something terrible. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I looked at Emily. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "It's in there," she whispered, almost as though she'd read my mind. "What's in there?" I asked, breathless. "I don't know," she replied, her voice shaking. "But I heard it. There's something that's not Ethan." My heart dropped. I ran to Ethan's room, pushing the door open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the hallway outside. But when I looked inside, I froze. Ethan was standing by the window, his back to us, staring out into the darkness. He didn't move, didn't respond when I called his name. I approached him slowly, my mind racing. "Ethan?" I asked again, my voice wavering. And then he turned around. His eyes were different. There was something wrong with them. They were too wide, too empty. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his lips were curled into a thin, unnatural smile. He didn't speak. He just stared at me. But then, just as I was about to reach out for him, something else happened. The room began to shake. The walls trembled. The floor beneath us creaked. And I heard the sound of something scraping, like nails running down glass, coming from inside the walls. The whispers were back, louder than ever before, filling the room like a chorus. "You can't run. You can't escape. You're ours now." I turned to Emily, my heart pounding. "We need to get out. Now." But as I turned to run, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The house was locking us in, and that's when I saw it. The shadows. They weren't just on the walls anymore. They were moving toward us, toward Ethan. The room seemed to fold in on itself, the walls stretching, the floor sinking. It felt like the very fabric of reality was unraveling. The house wasn't just alive, it was feeding, and we were its prey. "Mom? Dad? Help me," Ethan whispered, his voice hollow, broken. I reached for him, but it was too late. He was no longer my son. The room felt like it was collapsing in on itself. The shadows, those unnatural things that had once been mere figures in the corner of my vision, were now advancing toward us, as if they had a mind of their own. I could hear them, their low, buzzing whispers mixing with the shrill sound of Ethan's broken voice, calling out to me, but not really Ethan. "Mom? Dad?" His voice had an eerie cadence now, something far too grown up for a child of his age, as though something had been living inside him for longer than we knew. I took a step back, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. My eyes darted from the door, now completely sealed shut, to the window, which was strangely opaque, a thick fog clouding the outside world. Every direction seemed to offer no escape. I turned to Emily, her face drained of color, her hand clutching her chest as though she was trying to hold herself together. Her lips parted, as though she was going to speak, but no sound came out. The air was so thick it was hard to breathe, hard to think. Ethan stood still by the window, not moving. His gaze was locked in a trance-like stare, his body unnaturally rigid. And then, without warning, he tilted his head to the side, an almost imperceptible motion at first, before it snapped back, and his eyes, those wide, unnatural eyes, fixed on us once more. "You tried to leave?" His voice echoed, but it wasn't his voice. It was a chorus of multiple voices, layered on top of each other, all speaking at once. "You should have never come here." I couldn't breathe. My throat closed up as the words hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't Ethan anymore. The boy I'd once held in my arms was gone. This thing, this entity was wearing his skin. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She tried to take a step toward him, but something in her expression told me she already knew it was too late. This wasn't our son. I reached for her arm, pulling her back just as the air seemed to grow even colder. The temperature dropped in a matter of seconds, the chill seeping into my bones. The room became suffocating, and the shadows grew, stretching across the floor, the walls, the ceiling. The shape of a face began to emerge from the darkness, long and twisted, like something from a nightmare, with hollow eyes and a mouth that seemed to stretch wider than any human could. The whispers intensified, as if the house itself was exhaling through the walls, the windows, the floors. "You're in it now," came the voice again, but this time it was clearer, more deliberate. It came from all around us, not just Ethan. "The house will never let you go." I felt a sudden pull in my chest, a tightening, as though something was tugging at the very core of my being. My legs wobbled beneath me, my knees buckling, and I stumbled forward, landing hard on the floor. I heard Emily shout my name, but I couldn't focus. I couldn't think straight. My vision blurred as the room seemed to spin, the walls buckling inward, as though the house was about to swallow us whole. A scream tore through the air, but it wasn't mine. It wasn't Emily's either. It was Ethan, or what had once been Ethan, his mouth opening wide, far too wide, to release a shriek that seemed to rattle the entire foundation of the house. The room, no, the entire house began to scream along with him. The floors, the walls, the windows, the very structure itself seemed to reverberate with this horrifying sound, a noise so powerful that I felt like my skull was about to implode. My ears rang, my vision swam. I could barely think, could barely move. The sound seemed to go on forever, wrapping itself around me, tightening like a vice. And then, in a single, sudden moment, the scream stopped. Everything went silent. In the stillness, I felt a shift. The air became thick. Something was watching us. I turned my head to the corner of the room, where a figure had emerged from the shadows. tall and hunched, a grotesque shape moving with unnatural grace. The face, it was a face, but not a human face. It was twisted, like a grotesque mask of malice. Eyes too wide, teeth too sharp, and a grin that stretched impossibly far. I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. My throat was constricted, my body frozen in terror. The thing, whatever it was, moved closer, its dark form shuffling toward us with slow, deliberate steps. The air grew heavier with each one. My vision blurred, and I realized I couldn't breathe. And then, in that moment of pure terror, I understood. It wasn't just Ethan. It wasn't just us. We had all been part of it all along. The house, it wasn't a place. It wasn't just bricks and wood. It was alive. It had been alive for years, maybe longer. The shadows, the whispers, the voices, they weren't just spirits. They were part of the house's endless hunger, its twisted need to feed, to trap. The house had chosen us, chosen me, Emily, and Ethan, to be its next victims, to feed its insatiable need to grow. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that we had always been part of it, even before we arrived. The town, the house, the people, everything was connected, a never-ending cycle. As the figure reached for me, my body still unable to move, I heard one final whisper in my ear. "Welcome home." Suddenly, everything went dark. Several days later, the house stood empty, its windows dark, its walls silent. The neighbors spoke in hushed voices, whispering about the family that had moved in only a few months ago. The family that had vanished, leaving nothing behind but an eerie emptiness. No one ever saw them again. No one ever spoke of them. But the whispers continued, and the house waited. If you actually enjoyed these stories, please subscribe and leave us a comment to the next horror story you'll want us to tell. Till then, see you in the next one.